Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Renee Hopkins, for those of you who do not know me, and I'm the CEO of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility Foundation. It's great to see so many familiar faces here this morning and many new faces. So thank you so much for joining us today for our summit on the intersection of white supremacy and firearms. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we ask that everyone stay muted during the keynote and panel discussion, but please feel free to keep your camera on if you feel comfortable with that. For any questions today, we're going to be using the chat feature, which most of you are, I'm sure, Zoom efficient at this point, but it's at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our very best to get as many questions as possible during the panel discussion, as well as following our keynote. And finally, we're happy to offer CLE credits for this course for anyone located in Washington State. If you would like to obtain credit for the summit, please contact Chelsea with your license number. Their contact information will be in the chat for your reference. Well, it's hard to believe, but this is our 10th summit and second virtual summit. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us to dig into this really timely subject. Over the last year, we've been met with constant, painful reminders that gun violence and white supremacy are intertwined. The state-sanctioned killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others shone a spotlight on the fact that our systems are built on white privilege and power and wield violence against Black and brown people, so often carried out with a gun. The pandemic's disproportionate toll on BIPOC communities and its impact on gun violence show the cost of a country built on white supremacy. And the January 6th coup attempt exposed the threat that white supremacy poses to our democracy itself. And of course, last month's mass shooting in Atlanta is evidence of the danger of racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and all forms of hate fueled by guns. It is clear that we cannot end the gun violence epidemic without rooting out the white supremacy knit into the fabric of our country. And we cannot do that without understanding the history that got us here. I'm really looking forward to tackling this subject today, so I don't want to take up any more time. So I'm pleased to hand the program over to our keynote speaker, Mary McCord. Mary serves as a visiting professor of law and legal director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center. She is also a former Justice Department official, serving as the acting assistant attorney general for the national security. Mary is a leading expert on domestic terrorism and extremism, and we're so glad to have her here today. Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be asked to address this group. As I was telling Renee and others involved with the summit yesterday, I really think that you all are in a position to be really leading voices, not only in the gun violence prevention movement, which of course you are, but in level setting some of the mythology about the Second Amendment that is too often used, I think, to cloak racism and white supremacy behind this veil of sort of constitutional protections and constitutional rights. And I want to dispel some of that mythology today. Now, you're going to hear from some fantastic panelists after this keynote, historians, researchers, on-the-ground activists whose work is so important to this movement. And I'm looking forward to listening to that myself. I've drawn upon their work in some of my own work, but I really do want to take a little bit of time to highlight some of the current threats, some of the complacency across the country in gun violence and in escalating private militia activity, and leave you with some take-home homeworks that you can hopefully push forward and spread the word to debunk and dispel this mythology of the Second Amendment. So as I mentioned, that's a term, that's a constitutional right that has been used too often to cloak private militia organizations in this seeming constitutional protection. It's no different than use of the term patriots to cloak unlawful private militias in what seems to be respectable terminology. But these terms, Second Amendment, patriotism, they really can't erase the history that we know. And if we go back to the foundings of this country. We know that it were private militias that were often unleashed to track down escaped slaves, sometimes under the guise and direction of sheriffs who would use the law to deputize posse comitatuses to give a legality to these private militias. It doesn't change the fact that post-Civil War, KKK militias routinely deployed to disarm Black people who were exercising their newfound rights to own guns under the Constitution. It doesn't change the fact that post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, oftentimes militias, private militias, were the very ones who went tracking down Black people accused of crimes, sometimes petty crimes, and engaging in racial terrorist lynchings, things that we would today say in other countries are extrajudicial killings, meaning killings without going through any judicial process, without any adjudication of guilt. And it was often unlawful private militias that led that charge. None of these terms, patriotism, Second Amendment, also changes the fact that even in the much more modern post-civil rights movement, there was a resurgence of KKK militia activity. Late 70s, early 80s, with the opening of training camps around the country, so much so that the Anti-Defamation League sponsored model legislation adopted by 25 states that would allow states to shut down paramilitary training camps where the training there was to be used in furtherance of civil disorder. So it doesn't change anything about modern times either. So I think starting around in the 1990s, I think people started to get a different view of what militias were. And some of that racist past receded into memory as we started seeing famous armed standoffs, such as what we saw in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, or Waco, Texas. And this is where private militias primarily had anti-government ideology, and the standoffs were against the federal government. And they didn't necessarily affect other people going about their daily lives. This was a government, anti-government movement. And it extended into more recent times too, back in 2014, 2013, with similar armed standoffs against the Bureau of Land Management in Bunkerville, Nevada, at the Oregon Malheur Wildlife Refuge in close to many of you who hail from the Pacific Northwest. Again, armed standoffs against the federal government, dangerous in themselves because they're heavily armed. These were insurgencies against federal government and authority, but they weren't really engaging directly with members of the public or using their military and paramilitary tactics to intimidate or coerce members of the public. More recently, though, that's exactly what we've seen, particularly in the last several years. So, and this in large part was due, frankly, to the fact that in the ensuing decades, since those armed standoffs, there has been an appropriation of a mythology about the Second Amendment to give justification to unlawful private militias, and also to promote the idea that they have a role actually in governance in the United States, to cloak their history, their past, their often alliance with white supremacist causes, to cloak it in something that looked very different. So starting with these 1990s, we saw militias sort of rise and fall, oftentimes depending on who was in the White House. So it was very common if there was a Republican in the White House who they thought was more aligned with their Second Amendment rights, that they could lay a little bit lower. And then when a Democrat was in the White House, and this was very, very evident when Barack Obama was elected as president, this would start the rhetoric of the Democrats are coming to take our guns away. We must unite around our Second Amendment rights. And oftentimes what you saw was, particularly after 2008, when the Supreme Court decided the case of District of Columbia versus Heller. This is the case where for the first time ever, the court determined that the Second Amendment protected an individual right to bear arms for self-protection, self-defense in the home and on the person. Oftentimes we saw unlawful private militias say, well, we have a First Amendment or a Second Amendment right to bear firearms for self-defense. We are in an open carry state, therefore we can amass ourselves together as private armies And we are necessary, they would often say, as a check against the tyranny of the government. But what I want to talk about really today is that that's just a mythology. That is just not founded in our history. And we'll learn more about this, I'm sure, from Josh Horowitz in the next panel. It's not rooted in the text of the Constitution. It's not supported by Supreme Court precedent ruling on the meaning of the Second Amendment. And it's not supported by state laws around the country that ban private militias. So let's talk about that a little bit. I want to go back to August 12th of 2017. This is when we saw unlawful, private, self-professed militias come to Charlottesville, Virginia during the Unite the Right rally, ostensibly to protect the First Amendment rights of the white nationalists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and neo-Confederates who had organized that rally. Now, for those of you who don't know, that rally was supposed to be about protesting the city's decision to take down a Confederate monument, two Confederate monuments actually, of General Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And so this was used by white supremacist groups to say, we are going to have a rally against the taking down of these historical monuments. We're going to show that we are more than mean. We are going to step out of the virtual space of the internet and into the physical space, show that we have numbers, that we have power, and oppose the taking down of these Confederate statues. Now we know from the planning of this event that it really wasn't that much about Confederate statues, that the white nationalists who planned that event had actually had a very important tactic in mind. Their tactic was something I call provoke and invoke. Their idea was, we will provoke racial justice protesters, the counter protesters to us. We will provoke them to possibly toss that first water bottle at us, have the first sign of aggression, and we'll provoke with our anti-Semitic tropes, our anti-other signs, our Nazi symbols, our anti-Black and people of color and LGBTQ people rhetoric. We'll provoke them, and then once they throw that first water bottle, we will attack violently and we will invoke self-defense. They thought that this would be the perfect foil for any accountability. And who was there protecting them? Self-professed militias. The Pennsylvania Lightfoot, the New York Lightfoot, the 3% People's Militia of Maryland, the American Freedom Keepers, the American Warrior Revolution. Militias from as far away as the state of Washington came all the way to the East Coast to Charlottesville, Virginia, supposedly to protect the First Amendment rights of the protesters who were supposedly protesting the taking down of the Confederate monuments. And what they did is they stood guard in front of those protesters with their AR-15s in full military kits, helmets, flak jackets, combat gear, boots, radio control, and they usurped the role of law enforcement to themselves, arrogating to themselves the decision about when and under what circumstances to deploy lethal force. And who was standing by? Police in great numbers, right? And these militias wanted people to believe that they weren't there for anything that had to do with the ideology of the protesters, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, the neo-Confederates. They disavowed that publicly. We are ideologically neutral, they said. We are patriots here to support and defend the constitutional rights of the protesters. Well, it doesn't take a lot of scratching below the surface of Facebook posts, social media, and even YouTube videos that many of these militias, recorded before and after the Unite the Right rally, proud of what they had done, proud of what they're standing up for constitutional rights that day. It doesn't take much looking to see the white supremacist thread running through that rhetoric, running through their social media and their commentary. Now, I'm not saying every militia member is a racist or every militia member wants to create a white ethno-state, but that event in Charlottesville in 2017 was one of the first major times where we saw private militia members coming out very publicly in alliance, in support with avowed not even hidden white supremacist organizations, Vanguard America, the Traditionalist Workers' Party, KKK, skinheads, various different neo-Confederate and neo-Nazi parties. And of course, what we heard in the immediate aftermath was President Trump saying that there were very fine people on both sides. This was immediately used by not only white supremacists, but the militias as sort of like approval of their activity. And it was licensed to go forth and continue. And we saw that in the ensuing years. So we saw, you may recall, as there was a migrant caravan coming up through South America, Latin America, over to cross our southwest border. Now, I know that that's happening again now in the wake of so much violence and so much torture in Latin America, but it was also happening a few years ago. And you may recall President Trump calling on the military to go to the border and actually supplement our Customs and Border Patrol there because of what he deemed an invasion of Latinos at the southern border. And in response to that, we saw a nationwide militia call to arms to actually send militia members to the border, supposedly also to supplement against this Latino invasion. And in fact, one group decamped on the New Mexico border and went on to actually physically detain migrants and hold them for Customs and Border Patrol. Now, one of their members is now serving 2.5 years in prison, federal prison, for unlawfully assuming the functions of federal Customs and Border Patrol. But they thought nothing of the fact of deploying there, camping out there in full military regalia, semi-automatic assault weapons, and using these to unlawfully usurp the role of law enforcement and do so in a way that was aimed directly at these migrants. And one of their members, famously, it's been recorded, said, "Why don't we just shoot them? Why are we holding them for Customs and Border Patrol? Why aren't we just standing them up and shooting them?" We saw this kind of activity again in 2019 as impeachment proceedings were ongoing, the first impeachment proceedings, and we saw the President Trump retweeting tweets of others suggesting that if he were to be removed from office, that could trigger a civil war. And what did that spur from these militia groups? Some of the national groups, some who were involved, in fact, the most significant conspiracy charges coming out of the January 6th insurrection involved this particular group, who I will not name. Immediately there, they said, "You just say the word, President Trump. We are ready to be called forth in your defense. We are trained. We are armed. The AR-15 is the weapon of choice, and we are ready for a hot civil war." So that type, and was there any denouncing of that? No, of course not. That was something welcomed by the president, given credence by his veil, his veneer of credibility because of his position of privilege and power. But all of this pales in comparison to what we saw in 2020. So if you take us back a year now, it's been a year, over a year, since the pandemic began, and it was beginning to rage across America and was particularly spreading in places like Michigan and elsewhere, where governors were struggling to try to figure out how they could protect public health and safety. They were using their emergency authorities to enact stay-at-home orders and shutdown orders and masking orders ultimately. And the president, very, very opposed to this, began tweeting about it, began speaking out about it. And who answered that call? Again, private unlawful militias storming state capitals in Lansing, Michigan. In fact, I believe the photo, I recognize the photo on the opening slide for today's summit, looks to me like the photo from that storming of the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan. They stormed capitals in Boise, Idaho. They stormed governors' mansions in other places, Kentucky, Ohio, using their force, their unlawful armed force, to intimidate and coerce lawmakers, elected officials, as well as members of the public who also have a right, a First Amendment right, to go to their state houses and let their views be known if they are pro or anti these public safety orders. But they're terrified from doing so when they have to run a gauntlet of armed unlawful militias. And what was the response of the president? liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia, and save your great Second Amendment rights. Liberate, of course, being a term used historically about when a people are freed from an occupying force. It has the tone of the end of a war. And that's the kind of rhetoric that was used. Just, again, giving license to further such activity that are really insurgencies against the governments of those states. And of course, we saw that culminate ultimately in an insurgency against the federal government on January 6th of 2021. But moving on in 2020, not that long after the pandemic started, Memorial Day weekend, we had the killing, the murder of George Floyd, sparking immediate racial justice demonstrations, not just in the US, but around the world, largely peaceful, sometimes some destruction of property, some minimal acts of violence, not to belittle them, but in comparison to the vastness of the racial justice demonstrations, and the vast majority of which were entirely peaceful, these isolated acts of violence were quite minimal. But nevertheless, this was used, it was immediately propagandized by the former president and his surrogates into it being violent anarchists and Antifa rioting and looting. And this was another dog whistle for unlawful private militias. We will self-deploy. We are the patriots who support and defend constitutional rights. We will self-deploy to protect property, protect statues, again, Confederate statutes, other statutes. In New Mexico, the statue of a Spanish conquistador, as a militia deployed there to defend it during racial justice protests, resulted in a shooting and injuries. Kenosha, Wisconsin, at a Black Lives Matter demonstration for racial justice, local militias deployed supposedly to protect property. A young man joined forces with them and with his AR-15 shot and killed 2 people, shot a 3rd person and seriously injured him. These groups don't answer to public accountability. They don't answer to any governmental authority. They make their own decisions about when they will use that force. And in the meantime, they intimidate others and chill protected First Amendment speech. I started hearing from people as far away as Sandpoint, Idaho, Washington State, California, small towns in Virginia, Texas, New Mexico, the Northeast, saying, is this okay? Can these militias come out and protect property? No, it's not okay. And we're going to get to that. What else happened in 2020? We saw the rhetoric about the election. We saw it coming up even before the election. The rhetoric again coming out of the White House and with the White House surrogates, but propagated by extremists, conspiracy theorists, and unlawful private militias across the internet, saying that this election with mail-in voting is bound to be filled with fraud. Mail-in votes are susceptible to fraud. And if anyone other than Donald Trump wins this election, it will be the result of a rigged election. Now, we were worried, and you may wonder, why are we worried at all? I've been doing work, anti-militia work, ever since Charlottesville, and I'll get to that in a minute. We were worried that this would be yet again another reason for militias to say, we better go deploy to the polls, and we better protect against voter fraud. We will patrol, we will ensure that there is no voter fraud. And so many different people, elected officials, governors, state attorneys general, district attorneys, police chiefs, sheriffs, voting rights organizations, my organization and others worked with all to educate about the Second Amendment. This is not okay. It would not only be not protected and in violation of law for militias to go out to the polls, but it would be voter intimidation. And we were very worried about that happening, and became even more worried post-election. I'll tell you a little side note story. I worked with a lot of other people to put out a lot of different fact sheets and information about the fact that unlawful private militias are not protected by the Second Amendment. Put these out all over the country. They actually ended up getting passed around militia to militia online with some alarm. And I'm happy to say that actually on election day, one of the national militias put out a directive to its members not to show up in uniforms while armed at the polls. It could be interpreted as voter intimidation. And they cited to these fact sheets and they quoted from these fact sheets and even linked to them. So the word can spread. We can correct the record about what's lawful and unlawful. But let's continue on our time frame here, right? Post-election, there's a doubling down on fraud. The rhetoric about a stolen election, about stuffed ballot boxes, about ballots being counted 2 and 3 times, a concerted effort to get state legislatures to overturn the results. That was the rhetoric that was building from November 3rd all the way up to January 6th, which is a day that by Constitution and by statutory law was the day for the joint session of Congress to meet in the Washington, D.C. at the Capitol and count the Electoral College votes and certify the winner of the presidency and the vice presidency. And that's why that day was so important. And that's why that day was targeted by extremists, conspiracy theorists, unlawful private militia members, and I think citizens who'd been hoodwinked by the propaganda and thought they would come to Washington, D.C. to assert their First Amendment rights. The problem was with that big tent with so many extremists associating with others, the crowd became a mob. Those who had always intended, and we know this from charging documents coming out of the insurrection, those who had intended to actually use force and violence to stop the Electoral College tabulation by Congress, to prevent Congress from doing its constitutional duty, they were able to sweep in that crowd. That crowd became a mob. That mob committed an insurrection and really undermined our democracy in a way we had not seen for many, many years in Washington, D.C. And of course, the first most prominent and still most prominent conspiracy indictments to come out of the insurrection are against private militia members. So where does that leave us? If you remember only 3 things from this talk today, these are 3 very important things about dispelling the mythology of the Second Amendment. I'll run through them real quick and then I'll repeat them in great detail. First, there is no authority under federal or state law for groups of private individuals to join together, form their own private militia, their own private army. Second, the Second Amendment does not protect private militias, and the Supreme Court has made that clear as far back as 1886. Third, every state in the country includes either constitutional provisions or state statutes, generally criminal statutes, that prohibit private militias. So let's go through these. First, no authority under federal or state law. You may be saying, well, what about well-regulated militias? Oftentimes these militias, who these days many are eschewing the term militia in favor of terms like we are patriots, whose mission is to support and defend constitutional rights, but they organize themselves together while under arms, under their own command and control. They engage in paramilitary training and they project authority over others, that authority to use force or project the ability to use force against others. So they will often say, well, we're well-regulated. Well-regulated means us. We've got a commander, we've got a deputy commander, we train when we're out deploying, we have a hierarchy of command, we just don't all do everything we want, we're well-regulated. And that's exactly what existed in this country before the founding. Well, that is ahistorical. In fact, it's the opposite of what the militia meant even before the founding. Even back in the 1600s, as the colonies were founding themselves, they did not want to have standing armies. They were afraid that standing armies would infringe on their civil rights and civil liberties. So they instead decided to rely for their own defense on militias. And militia was defined by their own laws, their earliest militia acts, essentially as all able-bodied residents, really males, but all able-bodied men who could be called forth by the governor in defense of the state as necessary to repel any type of threat to the state, and would be armed and trained and governed by the governor. It was never the law back at that time or the practice that these militias would self-deploy when they saw fit, and certainly not in opposition to the government. And so even in the earliest militia laws, 1660 in Massachusetts, the law made it clear the militia existed in order to be a defense of the state. That was baked into our federal constitution, which speaks of a well-regulated militia, which gives Congress the power to call forth the militia and to provide for the establishment of militias even at the state level. And the Congress has done that. It did that through establishing authority for the states to have their own National Guard units and other state militias that report to the governor. It also was carried forward, this idea of well-regulated, in state constitutions. And all of the states include similar verbiage, and 48 of the 50 states include specific provisions that in all cases, the military shall be strictly subordinate to and governed by the civil authority, meaning the governor. In the states, it's the governor who can call forth the National Guard. It's the governor who can call forth other state militias, which many states have. And it's the governor who can call forth, for those states that still have it, the unorganized militia, which again harkens back to that ancient relic of all able-bodied persons between certain ages that could be called forth. Many states still have that, but it's only the governor that can call them forth, or the governor's designee, sometimes the adjutant general. And when so called forth, guess who they report through? They report through the state's military officers to the governor. They do not self-deploy, they do not self-report. So no authority under federal or state law. That was point one. Point two, the Second Amendment does not protect this. As I indicated early on, sometimes militia members will say, Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms. We're in an open carry state, therefore we can have our own private militia and we can basically carry our firearms and do what we want with them whenever we think it is appropriate. But again, nothing could be further from the truth. In 1886, the Supreme Court upheld a state anti-militia statute that still exists on the books of 29 states to this day, which prohibits bodies of men from associating together as a military unit or a military company, or parading or drilling in public with firearms. And the Supreme Court at the time in 1886 said there's nothing about this statute that infringes on the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment. And even though the Second Amendment at that time hadn't even yet been held to apply to the states, the Supreme Court had no difficulty in saying there's nothing here that would infringe. And moreover, states, it was without question, they said, that states must be able to prevent private paramilitary organizations in order to protect the public peace, safety, and good order. Now, fast forward to 2008, District of Columbia versus Heller. The Supreme Court decided for the first time, as I indicated earlier, that the Second Amendment protects this individual right to bear arms for self-defense. The majority opinion was written by Justice Scalia, conservative justice on the court, who pointedly contrasted that individual right to self-defense with private paramilitary organizations. He cited to the 1886 case, which is called Presser v. Illinois, and he said, no, Presser v. Illinois stands for the proposition that the Second Amendment does not prevent states from prohibiting private paramilitary organizations, and no one has even argued to the contrary, he said. So for all of the gray area there is still in the Second Amendment, this is not one of those gray areas. This is an area where the Supreme Court has been clear. The Second Amendment does not protect private armies operating outside of governmental authority, regardless of what they call themselves. So that's point two. Second Amendment doesn't protect this. Point three, all 50 states have some provisions in their law that prohibit private militias. As I already indicated, almost every state has a constitutional provision. And in fact, Washington states even goes further than strictly subordinating the military to the governor. Washington states go so far as to say there's no authority under our Constitution for private militias, bodies of men to associate themselves as private military units. But almost every state contains a subordination provision. 29 states can have on their statutes these anti-militia statutes, the same type that was upheld by the Supreme Court back in 1886 and has been upheld since then, has been enforced in the early 80s against the militia wing of the KKK in Texas. It was called the Texas Emergency Reserve Unit. And this statute was enforced against them to prevent their continuing harassment and armed use of force against Vietnamese refugees who had had a community there where they engaged in fishing as one of their sources of economic commerce and livelihood. These statutes were used effectively in North Carolina and other places across the South against, again, the militia wings of the KKK, who were harassing and intimidating and threatening and sometimes physically assaulting Black people in the South. So these statutes have been upheld, they've been used, but they largely sit on the shelf. 29 states have those. 25 states have the statute I also mentioned earlier, which is the Anti-Paramilitary Activity statute, which also exists on the books of the federal government, and that prohibits the training, demonstrating, instructing, or practicing with 2 or more people in the use of firearms, incendiary devices, or techniques capable of causing bodily injury or death, knowing or intending to use those during or in furtherance of a civil disorder. So we're talking about training camps. We're also talking about using those paramilitary tactics and firearms during a civil disorder, because that would be practicing in the use of those firearms during a civil disorder. We certainly saw that at the Capitol on January 6th. We've seen that both at the racial justice demonstrations and at anti-public health measure demonstrations and at Stop the Steal demonstrations. We've seen repeatedly this type of use of paramilitary tactics and firearms during a civil disorder. In fact, even if you're ostensibly protecting property, you're still against what you think will be violent anarchists or what you claim will be violent anarchists. That's still during what you anticipate to be a civil disorder. There's also statutes on the books of about a dozen states that prohibit the false assumption of the duties or functions of a law enforcement officer or peace officer. So for those who claim to be augmenting police forces, they're not only is there no authority under any of the states to do that, because it's a heavily regulated area. Even security guards have to get license and insurance and go through vetting and background checks, et cetera, et cetera. There's no authority, but in about 12 states, it's also criminal to do that. And that's the type of law that the federal statute has that was used against one of the members of an unlawful militia that was detaining migrants and holding them for Customs and Border Patrol. So the statutes exist. Why haven't they been used? And there's one other example I want to mention, because they have been used some, but not very often. And that's the example of the cases that my organization has brought. So immediately after Charlottesville, we heard commentators sort of throwing up their hands saying, what really can be done? First Amendment rights to freedom of expression by the white supremacists and white nationalists. Second Amendment rights to bear firearms. It's an open carry state, Virginia. You know, the hands of the government and the hands of the police are somewhat tied here. And what my organization, ICAP, thought was, well, First Amendment protects speech, but it doesn't protect violence. It doesn't protect incitement to imminent lawless activity. It doesn't protect threats. And the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms for self-defense, but it doesn't protect this armed, organized, coordinated, concerted private armies. And so we used Virginia's anti-paramilitary law, its constitutional strict subordination provision, its law against the false assumption of law enforcement duties, and its public nuisance law to bring a civil case on behalf of the city and its local residential associations and small businesses against 23 different militia organizations, white nationalist organizations, and their leaders, not for money damages for all of the harm that they did. And recall that this is an event that ended in a car ramming, an act of domestic terrorism that killed Heather Heyer and seriously injured dozens of other people. This was about, and there's other lawsuits for money damages for that injury. This was about preventing it in the future. This was a suit for injunctive relief based on these statutory authorities. And we were successful in those theories. We survived a motion to dismiss, and just before the 1-year anniversary of the Unite the Right, when the organizers, some of the organizers were planning a Unite the Right 2.0, We were right before trial, we ended up in a resolution of the case with all of the defendants, whereby they all agreed and the court ordered them to permanently not return to Charlottesville as part of a unit of 2 or more persons acting in concert while armed with any type of firearm or other weapon, anything to be used as a weapon during any protest, demonstration, rally, or march. We are now paired up with the district attorney in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a case against that unlawful militia there that self-deployed during a racial justice demonstration at the statue of a Spanish conquistador. Again, using state law to seek injunctive relief from the court preventing the future of the activity. But these examples are some of the only ones in our really modern history. And I think one question I get asked all the time is, why is that? Mary, you've told us it's not protected by the Second Amendment, there's no authority, there's state laws against it, then how come they're everywhere? They're in every state. How come they're oftentimes able to deploy right there in front of the police? How come the Kenosha police chief, he actually said after 2 people were killed and another shot by a militia member, actually said they were exercising their constitutional rights? Well, sometimes some of the police and law enforcement are ideologically aligned with militia members and take an absolutist view of the Second Amendment. And we see that, and you'll probably talk about it during the upcoming panel. We see that particularly in this constitutional sheriffs movement, this idea of sheriffs being the highest law of the land, answerable only to the Constitution. But of course, that's the Constitution as they see it, which is a very white supremacist laden Constitution. But it's also the function, I think, of just this mythology that people actually honestly believe that this is protected activity. They're not aware of their historical constitutional provisions in their statute dating back to the founding of their states. They're not aware of some of the statutes that date back to the 1800s or even frankly to the 1980s, because that's been a long time. And for local prosecutors, it's just not the bread and butter of what they do, which is, prosecute for your more typical and ordinary street crimes. But it also is a lack of political will, because many times the people responsible for, of course, enforcing state law, that burden falls primarily on local elected officials, elected sheriffs, elected police officials, elected district attorneys, who are elected by the very constituencies in parts of the country that tend to be the most anti-government, most pro-absolutist view of the Second Amendment, and pro-militia. And so there's very little incentive and very great disincentive for elected officials to enforce these laws against the very populace who will be re-electing them. In many states, the state attorneys general don't actually have authority to enforce general state criminal law. So they don't even have the same ability to enforce these that local officials do. And in other states, they also lack the political will. One of the things I'm working on right now is federal legislation that would address this gap. So that's some of the reasons I think we're seeing so little enforcement activity. But others is, there is an ideological problem here. There is the divide in the country right now, as we well know, is very much of an us against them. The movement of extremism, white supremacy, anti-racial justice movement is alive and well, and it's being cloaked, as I indicated before, in constitutional terminology like the Second Amendment, like we are patriots, like the bad guys are violent anarchists, and it's our job to do something about it. So I look forward to answering your questions. There's one thing I know right now that I neglected to say that I want to make sure that I do say, which is that even though the vast majority of the militias operating in this country, the private militias, are on the far right ideological spectrum, those are the ones responsible for all of the examples I've been giving about violence and lethality at public demonstrations. There are left-wing militias, many, many fewer in number, but they do exist. They so far have not been responsible for, violent acts, but this type of law is ideologically neutral on itself. It's just that it has been essentially used by the far right to really, again, cloak that sort of racism in the guise of constitutionality. So I look forward to your questions, and Renee, hopefully you will help me to tackle them.
Great, thanks so much, Mary. We could listen to you talk for hours. So let's jump into some of these questions. So first question is from Steph. And do you see a difference in enforcement when the law enforcement positions are appointed rather than elected?
So I really haven't, because I've just seen very little enforcement, as I indicated. And I think that, but I do think there is the potential there for a different attitude when it's an appointed position. It depends on who the appointment is coming from and where that person is in terms of his or her own views of the Second Amendment, his or own views of the militia movement. This is, this lack of political will and the disincentives to enforcing for many people are exactly why I think it's time for the federal government through the Congress to think about whether they need to have some statutory authority. I mean, right now, of course, there's no authority for private militia activity, but there's not just a general anti-militia criminal or even civil prohibition. And so this is something we know this isn't just a local issue. Take the insurrection with the travel of so many militias. Take Charlottesville, where I indicated militias traveled from all over the country. So it's bigger than a local problem. It's one that I think the federal government needs to make as a platform of its gun violence prevention and its extremism prevention.
That's a great segue into our next question, which you started to address here, but do you see this as a problem that needs to be addressed solely at the federal level or at the federal and state levels? And if you could just talk a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I think both. And so one thing that I think is important is just education. As I said at the beginning, this mythology about the Second Amendment, I think, has been so pervasive and so widespread that it is in large part, a reason we have seen the proliferation of militias with so little enforcement. And I think it comes from two factors. One, I think it comes from just honest misunderstandings about what the Second Amendment protects. There is so much rhetoric out there about, it exactly protecting private militias. In fact, the rhetoric is, and we'll hear more about this, I'm sure, at the panel, of this insurrectionist theory of militias, that they actually exist as a check on government tyranny, and that they have to be able to turn against the government if there is tyranny. Now, of course, who judges what the tyranny is? We know from history that at the time of the Constitutional Convention, when the federal Constitution was being considered, this was in the wake of armed insurgencies like Shays' Rebellion and others, which were based on taxes. Those weren't strictly race-based types of things, those were based on taxes. But at the Constitutional Convention, the framers didn't want to risk that kind of insurrectionist theory, which is why they gave Congress the authority to call forth the militia, and they provided that it would be a well-regulated militia regulated by the government that would govern. So, I think education that no, militias don't exist to counter the tyranny of the state is important. But so I think, and some of that, I gave a presentation to major city police chiefs before the election, trying to educate again on this militia activity, because we were worried about militias coming up to polling places. And some of these police chiefs are like, oh, it's not constitutionally protected, so we don't actually have to deal with these guys, because it's a threat to police as well. And they seemed like enlightened and empowered to know that they don't actually, there are laws against this. Now, again, sometimes it can be very dangerous for police when you are in the moment and you've got an armed militia with AR-15s with more lethal firepower than what the police have. Sometimes, they have to make a decision about how much enforcement they're going to do in that moment, but they can certainly do things after the fact and stuff like that. So I think education is important, but I also think some direction and leadership from the federal government is important. And already we are in a better place than we were, because we at least have, the FBI recognizing the threat of militia violent extremists. We have our federal government, recognizing the extremist threat and not supporting it and propagating it.
That's super helpful. So how do you think organizations like ours and more broadly than us, but definitely organizations like ours, how can we work to dispel the myth of patriots protecting rights to people who lean conservative but do not necessarily have strong backgrounds in the history of militias, and from a value standpoint are concerned about the direction of current social movements? And this question's from Jordan.
Yeah, I think it is important, even though today we have talked about, and the theme of this summit is, to show that there is a deep history of sort of white supremacy embedded in a lot of, the staunch absolutist Second Amendment view, gun rights view. And historically, there's no question that the data bears that out. But in those type of conversations, that's might not be the most helpful frame, right, in talking with conservatives. And so I think one of the values of the lawsuit we brought after Charlottesville is it was entirely ideologically neutral. In fact, among our defendants included a left-wing militia, because the lawsuit was based on the unlawful militia activity. And even though some of us might have been more ideologically aligned with the reason that left-wing militia was there to protect counter-protesters, they were doing the very thing that is a huge threat to public safety. They were arming themselves with AR-15s, creating an autonomous zone to keep out police and white supremacist protesters, and deciding when they were going to use these AR-15s. And our plaintiffs there, largely very progressive plaintiffs, when we came to them and said, we had a leftist group there, they're like, I don't care left, right, or other. This is dangerous. I don't want militias in my parks. I can't take my kids there when people are there with AR-15. So I think one way to approach it is, these are threats to public safety. You can't, whatever you want to cloak yourself in, patriotism or whatever, that role is for others. That role is for the government. And I kind of hate to use this term, but it's true. It's the government that has the monopoly on the use of force through military, National Guards, police forces, even, as I said, even private security companies can't just decide, okay, we're going to take up arms and protect things. They have to go through a process. So to the extent you can, first of all, debunk the notion that historically there was a right to private militias by simply, referencing history and the fact that even in the 1600s, states wanted the militias to be accountable to the governor, but also just being as ideologically neutral as possible about this is conduct we're talking about, not the content of anyone's ideology.
That's really helpful. So this question comes from Gloria, and she asks, do you accept that the Second Amendment protects individual rights to bear arms, which wasn't the case before Heller?
So, my own view at the time that Heller was decided, I'm in the District of Columbia. I was a prosecutor in the District of Columbia. District of Columbia had the most strict gun laws in the country. Basically, no one could get a permit for a handgun, and that's what went up to the Supreme Court. My view at the time, my legal view at the time, and it remains the case, was that historically that right to bear arms was associated with your right to be able to be called forth as part of the militia in defense of the state, and that it was tied to your lawful activity under governmental authority as part of a state-sanctioned militia. That is what previous Supreme Court precedent seemed to dictate. That is what history seemed to show. So my legal view is that that was not correctly decided, but it is the law. And the fact is that even with that right says nothing about private paramilitary organizations, and even a very conservative justice like Justice Scalia seemed to clearly recognize that.
Thank you for that. So staying with Justice Scalia, he considered himself an originalist. The Second Amendment was shaped when handguns were rare and assault guns were non-existent. Does this suggest that fundamental errors were the basis of the Heller decision? And what opportunity might states and local governments have to prohibit some guns for some private citizens or increase strong safety requirements for possession?
So, I mean, there are definite things that Heller left open. It left open, like lots of different limitations that it made clear. First of all, it made clear they were only deciding this narrowed question about, and frankly, it was in the home. That was the question at issue there. It was self-defense in the home, in defense of hearth and home. But it also made clear that there was nothing about the decision that was changing anything about laws, barring felons from having weapons, barring potentially, people with mental illnesses from weapons, nothing that was affecting paramilitary organizations and other categories. They also alluded to, within that opinion, to the fact that what the protection was for guns that were sort of in common use at the time. Now, obviously, obviously we're now not only protecting muskets. I mean, we could make that argument, but that argument is not going to survive. But I think what is important about that statement in the case is that the protection, there's nothing about Heller that would suggest that the protection should expand beyond the type of weapon that is used for self-defense, right? And so if that is now a handgun, then maybe a handgun is protected. But that is not now an assault rifle. I mean, people just don't use assault rifles for self-defense. There's no reason for that. And so I think that there is still, and all of this is open, by the way, the Supreme Court hasn't really given, other than Heller, any direction on this. But I think there are very strong arguments supporting limits on the types of weapons, including limits on assault rifles. So there's something that's protected, but it would need to be analogous to what was, at least in the majority's view in Heller, thought to be, thought that the right extended to back at the time of the founding. And again, these aren't one for one, right? The technology never existed at the time. This is one of the problems with originalism, but even if we, try to make that one for one, I just don't see it extending to assault rifles. And certainly the Supreme Court also was very clear that there was nothing about its opinion that extended the right to sensitive places, right? Like government buildings. And I think that is so, so important. I mean, if you didn't think it was important before, you sure should think it's important now after what we saw at the US Capitol as well as other state capitals. And there's just, no reason in my mind that at the very place where legislation is debated, where oftentimes public views are very, the views are sometimes antagonistic to each other, people disagree about things, that is a worse place to have guns. And so, I think a good agenda item is to work with states to legislate to ban firearms at state houses and allow local jurisdictions to ban them within, county halls, town halls, public facilities, which actually leads me to one other thing that I think is so, so important, which is the firearms regulation preemption statutes. 43 states have some variant of the firearms regulation preemption statute. These were pushed by the NRA, and it basically, the states say, local towns, local cities, you can't do anything, not even take an ordinance, a resolution, a motion. You can't do anything that would regulate the carrying or possession of firearms. They also talk about the transfer and the distribution, and maybe that's okay, but the carrying and possession of firearms. And they attach to this draconian penalties. Like if you're sued for violating this and you lose, you pay attorney's fees of the other side. And in some cases you pay punitive damages. So this has so hamstrung local officials. I mean, a lot of the work I've done in the last few years is I'll get a call from a city manager in some small town somewhere saying, the KKK is coming for a White Lives Matter rally. We know they're going to have guns. What can we do? We have this firearms regulation preemption statute. And so we're scared to death that if we prohibit them from bringing guns to the rally, that we're going to get sued and we're going to owe all this money. And if you are in law enforcement in a town where a White Lives Matter rally is coming, the first thing you want to do is ban firearms. So you are taking away that tool for public safety that they need. And those laws really need to change. Virginia last year created exceptions to those laws. And frankly, the law shouldn't exist anyway, but there needs to be exceptions so that law enforcement can manage public safety, particularly when they think there's going to be a rally of the Unite the Right type of rally where you're going to have people on both sides who are coming intending, or at least one side intending to provoke conflict with the other side.
Yeah, sadly, we are very, very aware of that in Washington State. And I think our neighbors to the south in Oregon are moving a piece of legislation now that would lift preemption for demonstrations, for cities to regulate open carry, which is great. So very timely. Really appreciate your answers and your great keynote, Mary. We're going to transition to a quick break. Let's do a quick 5-minute break, and then we will reconvene and start handing the program off to our amazing panel. So thank you so much, Mary. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
An amendment as a tool of political dissent. And I remember when I wrote the book, Mary, if you're still here, and Kathleen, I know you'll maybe get a kick out of this, people said, you're being precious. That could never happen in the United States. Obviously it's happened throughout our entire history, so why wouldn't it happen? Why wouldn't it happen now? You know, after the bombing, the Oklahoma City, the Murrah Federal Building in 1995, I thought maybe that the militia movement, the gun movement, the white supremacist movement that had come together to create those conditions would be on the run, would be on the wane, that people would walk away from that movement. But in 2000, at the NRA convention prior to the election, when Charlton Heston, the president of the NRA, thrust the musket over his head and said, you know, yelled, out of my cold dead hands, Mr. Gore, I knew that I was wrong, that the tides of history in the United States were still moving forward, and that there was an effort to build a new permission structure around political violence. And that permission structure absolutely has allowed for the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the storming of the Michigan militia, countless acts of individual hate and violence and racism, and ultimately led to the insurrection at the US Capitol. So Donald Trump understood the tides of history. He understood how to activate the tides of history. And he knew who he was talking to, and he played that white supremacist movement like a fiddle. But it's important to note that it wasn't Donald Trump who created that permission structure. He helped activate it, but he was a player in something that was already developing. So when you go back, you know, somewhat of a generation before Trump, and you think of people like Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution and all that stuff, he, you know, was the one who said the Second Amendment isn't about duck hunting. And Mike Huckabee, the governor of Arkansas, now talk show host, et cetera, famously said, the Second Amendment gives me the last line of defense against tyranny, even the tyranny of my own government. And so that was something that's been widely adopted as a view of the Second Amendment, especially on the right, but I think oftentimes sort of tacitly not pushed back on by the left and just allowed to fester. But the problem with all that is that, right, one person's free and fair elections look, you know, in places like Atlanta and Detroit, looks like tyranny to somebody else, right? And that's what the real bottom line here is, right? It's, you know, to a white supremacist, tyranny isn't dictatorship, because they like Trump, right? They had someone who looked like a dictator. It's not fascism, right? It is people from Black and brown communities voting in America, and voting reflecting the diverse nature of our society. That's what tyranny looks like to them. So the idea that there's a right, an insurrectionary right, political violence, when you think there's tyranny, cannot be in our Constitution, has to be ahistorical, but most importantly, incredibly dangerous to our democracy, right? And so I think one of the things we have to understand, though, is it's serious. We saw this insurrection at the Capitol. We see a revision now of that, where it's trying to be, oh, it wasn't that bad. This is not going to go away without a serious effort and fight on our part. And if you look carefully, if people who watched the inauguration of Joe Biden may have seen Ted Cruz sort of skulking in the corner, but I don't know if you noticed this, but he had a mask on, a face mask, as he was required to do, that said, "Come and take it." And "come and take it" is a famous militia clause. They often say it in Latin. It's called "mulan labe," come and take my guns and see what happens to you. It's a declaration basically of war. Okay, and it's saying I get to have whatever firearm I want, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's what "mulan labe" means. So Ted Cruz is actively trying to get that mantle and to be just like Donald Trump and play that movement and bring that movement to fruition. So today, we want to unpack the rise of the militia movement, of white supremacism and the gun rights movement, and why they're all coming together today. Where did it come from? How is it affecting our communities, and what we can do to stop it? And those are what we want to start with. But we also want to turn the lens back on ourselves. We want to make sure that as a gun violence prevention movement, that we're fully supporting equity, that we're actively breaking down white supremacy and not spreading its constructs, the carceral state, centering, I think, over-reliance on law enforcement. I think it's very important that we make sure not only that we're saying white supremacy, how do we get rid of it, but making sure that at the same time that we are looking for a more equitable world, a more equitable movement, a more equitable process in our own right. And I think that's very important. So what we can do to create and break down the structures of white supremacy are going to be very important. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today with this great panel. Kathleen, I want to start with you if that's okay. Okay, and I'm not sure where David went. Is David still here, or did he have to drop off?
No, I'm here. Sorry, I was having a little technical issue.
Okay, great.
I'm here.
No worries. I'll get to you as well because you're going to be part of this. So, Kathleen, thank you for being here and a pleasure to meet you. We haven't met in the past, so I'm really glad you're here. In doing a little prep for the panel, I read some of your articles and I was really taken by a couple of phrases. I want to read something back to you that you wrote in the New York Times op-ed. This is what you said in the New York Times. But the nation at the heart of white nationalism is not the United States. It is the Aryan nation, imagined as a transnational white polity with interests fundamentally opposed to the United States, and for many activists bent on the overthrow of the federal government. You wrote that in 2019, much like Casey and I prefigured some of this. Clearly, I'm sure you weren't surprised by this. And you'd also said that movement, comparable in size to the much better known John Birch Society, never faced a major prosecution or crackdown that hobbled its activity. As a result, it was able to sink deep roots into society, largely under the radar of most Americans. So those are very salient words, right? And thoughtful words. So tell us about your work, and much of it prefigured and warned about this moment. How did you know that? What did you see?
Thank you so much. And I should just begin by saying I'm also a proud alum of the UW, so go Huskies, and I'm happy to be in Washington. And I wish I was with you in person in Seattle. So I'm a historian of the recent past, and my first book, Bring the War Home, is really about the coming together and radicalization of the white power movement, which brought together Klansmen, neo-Nazis, and then later skinheads, militiamen, and a number of other kinds of activists into one social movement. And I traced the way that the Vietnam War had a hand in bringing together that groundswell, and also how that movement came to produce the Oklahoma City bombing. I would argue to you, as I argue in the book, that bombing should not be thought of as a lone wolf action, but as an act of coordinated domestic terrorism brought about by a social movement. It's decades of organizing that lead to that moment. And that the Oklahoma City bombing really belongs on a short list of atrocities right up with Pearl Harbor and 9/11. But we Americans generally don't walk around with a shared history about what that was and what it meant. And we do so at our peril, as we saw on January 6th. So the role of guns in my book is enormous. Over and over again, this movement that I document meets with different kinds of resistance that are quelled in one way or another by armament. This is a movement that is incredibly focused on not just legally obtained guns, although some legally obtained guns, but also uses things like the systematic theft and obtaining of stolen weapons from military posts and bases, the manufacture of their own military grade weapons, including napalm and homemade landmines, and campaigns to get weapons like anti-tank guns, surface-to-air missiles, rocket launchers, et cetera. This on top of a coordinated set of paramilitary training camps that are designed to operationalize activists for battle, ranging from urban warfare to surviving nuclear attack to other kinds of waging war on the state. The thing that Josh brought up about the nation and white nationalism, I think is really important, because I think many people hear the phrase white nationalism and think, aha, this is another kind of patriotism, right? Like this is simply overzealous patriotism. This is some kind of constitutionalism run amok. And I would argue to you that it is not that. It should not be understood as democratic or as related to our founding principles in most meaningful ways. Instead, what we're looking at here is a deeply revolutionary movement. And I say that to convey that these are activists who set out to overthrow the federal government. They believed that that's what they were doing. They attempted to do so with military-grade weapons, with coordinated nationwide activity that brought in activists in all regions of the country, men, women, and children, people across social class, and really brought people together in a lasting and meaningful social movement. And that's the thing that we have to keep in mind going forward. What we saw on January 6th is the collision of a bunch of streams of right-wing activity. One of them has to do with sort of the garden variety Trump base, many of whom really were there, I suppose, to express their free speech and to convey their displeasure in our electoral methods. And we have QAnon believers who were there on January 6th. I think most people are not yet well positioned to speak about QAnon. And I have to say, of course, that I'm a historian, so I'm extra inclined and disciplinarily trained to hang back before I say anything with new movements. But it's brand new. It's very fast. It's very distinct from what we've seen before. And in many ways, I think that it is a X factor that we don't fully appreciate. But the third strand is white power activism. And here we're talking about something that is not at all new. It is decades, if not generations old. It is using the same playbook that it has been using since the late 1970s, and it has very predictable outcomes. One of them is to use an attack on the Capitol as a show of force in order to radicalize and recruit other people, and then to follow that up with mass casualty attacks. So I think that there's very good reason to think that what we saw on January 6th was an opening salvo and something bigger, and that we should expect mass casualty attacks moving forward if we don't mobilize across multiple spheres of society to demand a confrontation with this problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathleen. I really appreciate that, and I dropped off for some reason for 1 second there. So I'm interested in a couple things. So how do we confront this, right? I mean, I think we have to be very careful that we don't want to create more of a surveillance state, right? We don't want to create more tools that can be used in all sorts of ways, but we do have to confront white nationalism. What do you think? What do you think some of the ways to do that are?
So as a historian, I share that concern about expanding police power. We know that uniformly, expansions of police power have resulted in increasing prosecution and incarceration wielded against communities of color. And that's not the outcome I think we want here. The outcome we want here is better use of existing legal instruments and existing police powers, if that, to constrain this violent problem. I think that there's also a very major hurdle here in using policing as the main form of facing white power activism, because we have a likely extensive infiltration problem within our police units. How big that problem is, we don't know. I live in Chicago, and one thing we've learned from the Laquan McDonald shooting, which was a police shooting of a young Black man in our community, is that there is hardly any record keeping in police departments, and that often police violence is not prosecuted because people simply move from one police department to another rather than carrying a record of activity with them. If we have no central oversight mechanism for police violence, we have to believe we also don't have a central oversight mechanism for white supremacy and white power violence in police departments. Even where we do have those mechanisms, like the Department of Defense and the Army, we see that they have not been operationalized the way they need to be to even count how big this problem is, much less to take decisive action. So all that is to say that white power activism as one component of gun violence, what we need here is a solution that goes across multiple scales of our society. We need better dialogues within our communities about our shared history of racial violence and racial injustice. We need mechanisms for addressing the racial inequalities that still create the systems of participation in our communities. We need different kinds of reporting that seek to bring these events into the same story. Most people read about Boogaloo or the Proud Boys, or maybe you read about Charleston or Christchurch without realizing that all of those events are part of the same groundswell. And I'm sympathetic to why that is hard to do, right? You open Twitter and it's a fire hose of horrible information at all times, it seems. But simply paying attention and connecting these acts together really puts it in different perspective. So by my lights, this isn't something that can be addressed by any one of these changes, right? Like this isn't just a matter of we need a different law. We need a whole slew of solutions that go across different parts of our society. We need de-radicalization. We need resources for high school teachers and librarians who are on the front lines with teenagers. We need better oversight mechanisms in policing and the armed forces. And then we also need courts that can return convictions, which is a really complex process to think through.
And obviously, Cliven Bundy is walking around today after, basically stealing $1 million from the federal government, right? So there seems to be a great injustice there as well. David, turning to you on some of the remedies. I know you through your work on extreme risk protection order and domestic violence. And I've been intrigued by some of the things that you've been doing on the, thinking about holding, white supremacists accountable through civil protection orders. And is there a civil process here that could add on to what Kathleen's saying and address some of this?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I guess I would say, there's a lot of great thinkers that are on this panel today, and I'm a practitioner, right? I'm just a lawyer, doing my thing, and but I've been lucky that my unit in Seattle has been given resources to look at firearms removal in domestic violence cases. It's kind of like the most obvious risk reduction technique that you could use. And with that, ERPO came along really at the same time legally. And so people just attached ERPO to our unit. And so we ended up really looking at ERPO and how are we going to systematically deploy this in a community? How are we going to work with law enforcement? And I advocated multiple years ago that this is a tool for responding to ideologically motivated violence. And so I have a quick PowerPoint, which I'm sorry that I brought a PowerPoint to this panel. But I'm going to share it. I'm going to run through it really quickly because there's a couple of cases on it which will at least give you some idea of our approach. I also am putting into the chat an article that I'm standing in today for my colleague Kim Wyatt, who's our main ERPO prosecutor. Kim's an amazing resource. She testified in front of the Senate on firearms. And so Kim, the manager of the program, Sandra Shanahan, and myself wrote an article about the practitioner's perspective of how you implement ERPO. And I think it really aligns with a lot of community approaches to how do we have a more holistic and thoughtful response to reducing firearm and using ERPO. And I would say that the first thing the criminal justice system needs to do is use the tools that it already has. And it needs to identify cases, it needs to investigate it, and it needs to do the work that is already in front of it, which has not been a priority for many years. And it needs to be looking at that and prioritizing it. That's the main issue. Is this a priority or not? So I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna give you a couple of resources as well. Just a second.
So, and as soon as you do that, I just want to put Greg and Gloria on deck. Then I'm coming to you guys next. As soon as David's done with this, I want to make sure we get everybody included here.
I'm going to go real fast. Ideologically motivated violence. This is the unit. It's multi-jurisdictional, multidisciplinary. We have many different folks involved in this unit. We're trying to take an upstream approach to gun violence with ERPO, with disarming DV perpetrators, community education, and collaboration. We look at our work as intersectional. Homicide, suicide, officer fatalities, community violence, and mass shootings. And we are working from a definition of ideologically motivated violence. This is a legal definition. And let me put this down. Because legally we need you need words, you need actions, and you need behaviors that folks present as a high risk of harming or committing harm to others. This intersection of speech is very complicated. And violent political speech has deep roots in this country. It is protected. And so how you intersect with that is something that we've involved many lawyers in my appellate unit and other people, but we've still wanted to go forward and say, well, where, we want to learn, we want to do this. And so we've had cases that we found, and we've been screening. I think the most important thing that I want to communicate to people is we screen for this all the time. We feel like ideologically motivated violence comes through things like domestic violence protection orders. So one issue is, how do we talk to victims? My unit provides protection order advocacy in King County. We're talking to several thousand victims in civil protection order proceedings every year. And so when we talk to people, we want to ask them, how can you identify the firearm, right, involved? If we're going to remove the gun, what kind of gun is it? These are basic questions that you want to be smart about. And then we want to interview people, and we want to ask them basic questions about, have you been threatened? How long have you lived together? Where are the guns? And then getting into questions of, where are the weapons? Where are they stored? Who is this individual involved? Do they hunt? And asking them about questions related to bomb making and concerns about specific groups. And what we found is, by having, these are advocates, these are domestic violence advocates, they're highly trained social workers, and they're having a trauma-informed conversation with victims who are in trauma, and they're talking to them about, intimate details. And these are investigative, and we tell people that up front. And what we found is, people will share with us the concerns that they have, and they want us to do something about it. So when we look at ERPO, which Josh could talk about all day, which is a wonderful tool, it is civil. It's designed to intervene prior to gun violence occurring, and it has certain standards associated with it. And one of the keys is coordinating with law enforcement. So collaboration has to be a part of identification and investigation. So an example of this is, one of the first cases we had an individual taken to a local hospital as a crisis evaluation. And that individual disclosed fantasies of wanting to commit a mass shooting. He had neo-Nazi ideology and ties, and we secured an ERPO to remove the many firearms that person had. We had another case that made national news. This is, as far as we know, the first time ideologically motivated violence was the basis for an extremist protection order. We had a local, what I'll term to be a terrorist organization in Washington, the Atomwaffen Division. They organized hate camps, they put out materials, they had all sorts of stuff, they did firearms training. They had an individual who was detained. Canada can ban people for life as a result of their beliefs. We believe there were threats of mass violence. They had called for a race war, and this is what we took from that individual. So we looked at that as an important step in the legal response, that you can't just, we can talk about these things all day, and it's noble to talk about culture change, and we need to achieve culture change. We shouldn't stop trying to do something about it today. And so that's what we're trying to do, and we're learning from that. But there's other examples where we have cases as an individual in my community who posted this on social media. When the Joker movie came out, this appeared to us to be a threat of mass violence. One ticket for Joker, please. And on his stream of Twitter posts were things like this. So he is an incel, and he had promoted many different views about wanting to do harm to women. I will shoot any woman anytime for any reason. I really just want to punch a woman so hard her entire body buckles and collapses. So we secured an extremist protection order. We took those weapons, but then we had a final order hearing, and he came in with his lawyer and basically indicated that he just said that stuff to be provocative, and the court believed him. And so we didn't secure the extremist protection order for as a permanent order. We only secured it as a temporary one, but we learned from that as well. Is there a different way we could have gone about that? What do courts want to see? How are we educating our courts as we go through and we do this type of work? So I guess what I wanted to communicate is, I'm a practitioner for now, right? What are we doing today? What am I doing by noon? We have a 24/7 hotline, basically a warrant call for extremist protection orders in my community. Law enforcement wants to do one in the middle of the night. We did one last night at 11:30. And so ideologically motivated ERPOs are more challenging legally, and we have a team of people who are dedicated to working on those. but that's a capacity question. And it's an identification question, it's an investigation question, and it's a collaboration question. And this is not the answer. This is not the answer, but it's part of the answer. You have to be able to do this well, and you have to show people that there are consequences. And Josh, the statement that some people make, it's very provocative. Come and take it. Okay, I will do that. We have to have the capacity to do that. It has to be effective. It has to be real, or people will think it never happens. And it's had a lot of waves from it as a result. And so we want to build on that practice. We want to share it with other prosecutors. We think prosecutors can be part of the solution in a productive way. That's what our hope is. So that's my talk.
Thank you, David. I think it's interesting because, we see the hashtag disarm hate a lot. And so what does that mean? I think you're actually working on that part of that. What does it mean to disarm hate? And trying to use the civil justice system in a way that's effective, but also respects due process and hopefully doesn't I think get into the overcriminalization world as well. Like I think you're trying to remove an immediate threat, right, from white supremacism.
Right, that's right. But sometimes it can lead to the neo-Nazi case. Some may have seen that our ERPO led to criminal charges in Texas when that individual went and obtained additional firearms. So he was in violation of our ERPO, but the ERPO being kind of full faith and credit and enforceable in 50 states, and what are the consequences for that, and what should we do about it? It's an important tool, but it's also an important tool not to be abused. I mean, there is this line that violent political speech is protected. And so how does the law then align with that? And that's why it can't be the full answer, right? I mean, if it only can intersect in these minor areas, but in the places where it does intersect, it has to be effective and it has to be professional. And that's our goal, is to build this as a normal part of practice and to have people look at the civil justice system where we operate as amicus. So we're the law enforcement's the moving party, but we're the lawyer. We act as a friend of the court, and we just want people to be safe and remove firearms.
All right. Thank you for being part of this. I appreciate it today. Let me turn to Greg. The Community Justice Action Fund has done some amazing work. I mean, being the main mover in getting a commitment from the Biden administration for $5 billion in funding for community violence prevention programs, just incredible work. First of all, kudos for you on that. But I mean, as someone who leads an organization that's focused on making sure that Black and Brown lives matter, that making sure that the violence, that you address violence from that framework, from an equity framework. How does white supremacy and what we're seeing at the Capitol affect your work and affect your constituencies?
Yeah, this conversation is really challenging for me because, when I think about white supremacy, I don't think about the radical people, running through the halls of the Capitol with Trump signs. I think about my great grandfather who worked on a farm his entire life, a farm we thought he owned, and he died in debt. And we had to pool our money to pay for his funeral and watch young 20-year-old white kids move his stuff out of what we thought was his house because he was a sharecropper. When I think about white supremacy, I don't think about the guys in Charlottesville because the person who organized that, Jason Kessler, was in my class. We both went to Fluvanna County High School. He signed my yearbook. I don't see him as this radical, killer, crazy, alt-right person. But when I was shot 8 years ago, when I went to the hospital and frankly was bleeding to death, I was interfered with my treatment by 3 law enforcement officers who investigated me for being a criminal. And then when I refused to answer their questions, laughed, were making jokes about me in the emergency room. Like, to me, that's what I see white supremacy. And so I really struggle with our train of thought that this white supremacist thing is something that's new, it's revolutionary, it's political. No, this is the foundation and fabric of our country. Law enforcement was created in 1704 as a version of slave patrols, right? And in 1838 to police around shipments of containers in Boston, right? Like, when we even come from this crime control law enforcement lens, we are instantly reinforcing white supremacy, in my opinion, and not in my opinion, in my analysis of history. The biggest threat to the Black community. When we think about white supremacists, the one organization that's done the most harm to us as a community is not the Proud Boys, it's law enforcement. And we're watching it happen right now. You can turn on CNN right now, and that's what we see. And so when we think about what's happening in our country, James Baldwin had a really good statement one time. He said that, we keep talking about white supremacy in the game and the system. The system is running. It is running exactly how it was designed so long ago. And we are so blind to it that we're focusing on moments and instances and individuals, but we're not looking at the institutions that have already oppressed and destroyed so many of us. And so as it pertains to gun violence and how it interacts with white supremacy, I think just coming from this whole strategy of reducing gun violence, starting with law enforcement, reinforces it. That to me is white supremacist. That is a white supremacist thought. The way that we address gun violence is by dealing with it as the public health crisis that it is, and looking at the risk factors that lead to violence. Now we know that there will be people who break. There will be people who go off the deep end, for lack of better words, and commit violent offenses. But that is not what is impacting 100,000 people every year when we think about the crisis of gun violence. And so if we're not looking at the risk factors that lead to violence, whether that's suicide, whether that's homicide, whether that's domestic abuse or domestic violence, then we're overlooking the crisis and we're just elevating this white supremacist law enforcement criminal strategy that has already destroyed our communities for decades. And if we want to keep it pretty relevant, we can just look at the war on drugs and look at how that destroyed our communities, and look at how that in its own way shifted firearms and who has the firearms into the hands of children, because that was the only way for the drug industry, which was known to be funded by the government. There's a lot of movies and documentaries on that. But that entire approach to addressing this crisis, addressing violence with violence, has failed and destroyed Black communities so much. And this discussion is really hurtful almost, because to overlook that when you start in this conversation about white supremacy is kind of overlooking the entire known history of my family and my ancestors. And so I think if we want to think about white supremacy in a real way, we have to think about how do we break down the systems? How do we see this for what it really is and not just a blip on the radar? It's not the 600 people who ran into the Capitol on that day. It's what fueled that, what built that, what created that, and how many of those people who ran into the Capitol are cousins or aunts or neighbors to everyone here on this call, right? And what are we doing to attack it from multiple fronts? And also the other thing is, what can we do to reverse that tide by righting the wrongs? And so for us, a major way we can do that is by investing in public health solutions to address gun violence, just like we have done with any other major public health crisis in America. Donald Trump himself invested $9 billion to address the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis has not taken as many lives as gun violence has. So if Trump can step up and address a health crisis with real investment and real resources, then we as progressives, we as activists, we as Democrats, we as people should be just as invested, or if not overly enthusiastic, about addressing the risk factors versus just thinking about what do we do on the tail end? How do we incarcerate? How do we get the bad guy? I'm a survivor of gun violence, but I also have a first cousin who was a perpetrator. And if we were in the room having lunch with you, you wouldn't know the difference between either of us. And so this concept of going to get the bad guy and attacking this problem through law enforcement and incarceration is harmful, but it's also ineffective. And we've seen that for decades now. And so when we think about how white supremacy is harming Black and brown communities, it's harming us because we're not focusing on the real issues. We're not focusing on the real oppression, and we're not investing nor making the sacrifices to reverse those. And it's in every space of our progressive movement, even on this call, unfortunately. And so that would be my answer to the first question, Josh.
Well, Greg, thank you for that. I really, really appreciate your perspective on that. When you talk about some of those root causes and you say, where should we be investing? How do we turn these systems around? Where would you like to see those investments?
So we look at it, if this is a public health crisis, there are triage things we can do, and there are long-term things. The triage is very simple. How do we invest in resources to support survivors of gun violence, to make sure they're recovering and rehabilitating through that trauma in a healthy way? How do we invest in violence intervention programs that can de-escalate known conflicts through trauma-informed care, through conflict resolution strategies that we know work before the police show up, because we know that the police cannot de-escalate anything. And you guys are watching it on CNN right now. It's investing in programs that work with those who are most at risk, who already have the risk factors, to help them navigate into a better or healthier lifestyle, which we know works. We've seen that done with other forms of crisis. And so those are the triage things we can do. But then when we think about long-term, you know, it's pretty straightforward in most urban cities. It's how do you improve quality of education? You know, my high school, not my high school I went to, but the high school in the neighborhood I live in has a 51% dropout rate, right? But to walk to that high school, which is 6 blocks from my house, I'm going to pass at least 5 police cars. And when I get to that school, the bathrooms don't even work outside in the field. The track is falling apart, right? So where are we putting our money? Locking people up or investing in folks? You know, I think Frederick Douglass said it's easier to raise a strong child than to repair a broken man. But right now, we're just all focused on the brakes. Another huge thing is housing instability, making sure that folks have healthy, safe neighborhoods to live in. And that doesn't mean taking the bad guys out. It means making sure that the conditions that folks stay in are healthy. In my neighborhood, folks wonder, why are guys always outside in the corner? Why are they all hanging out? They're not dealing drugs. There's no air conditioning units in the building. So in the summertime, what are you gonna do? Sit in there and swelter? No, everyone comes outside. But no one's cracking down on the housing and the slumlords that are leading to that. They're just saying those guys are loitering and not asking the question of why are they outside? We don't want to sit outside 100-degree weather. So it's looking at those long-term things that fuel this cycle and start to change that. And it's not something that law enforcement can do, nor should they do. I mean, I did ride-alongs when I worked for DC government, Office of Neighborhood Safety. And the first thing the police officer would say is, I'm overwhelmed. I can't do all this. This is not my job. I mean, every single one that's on the street will say that. But then every chief of police will ask for more money, community policing. We need this program, that program. When the folks on the street just want government to work the way it's supposed to and help these communities live a higher, better quality of life so that their incidents are less. So I think those are some of the long-term things that we can work on, but it does take a comprehensive strategy. It does take vision, but most importantly, it takes sacrifice, and it takes acknowledging the issues for what they are and stop looking at the bandage approaches that frankly are failing. And our criminal justice system is one of those bandage approaches that we know has been failing forever.
All right, thank you, Greg. Gloria, let me bring you into the conversation because you've worked in the intersection of equity and gun violence prevention for a while. What do you think is a gun violence prevention movement? We need to do better to increase equity, to address some of the concerns that Greg has mentioned. I know that you've expressed in the past. How do we do that? Where do we pivot? Can we do that? What are the things that we should be doing now and learning about now?
First of all, I find it hard to follow Greg, but at the same time, what Greg said. So I will, hopefully my remarks will back up everything that Greg said. So I'm very glad to be here in this conversation. Excuse me. Thank you for the opportunity. For those of you who have never heard of Moms Rising is an online and on-the-ground organization of more than 1 million moms and family members across the country working together to build a nation where everyone can thrive. And I'm here because I lead Moms Rising's gun control campaign, and Moms Rising sees and fights white supremacy every day across all of our advocacy. And in our view, fighting gun violence goes way beyond extremism, white nationalism, militias, law enforcement. It's all about structural racism and white supremacy. So from the beginning, white supremacy has oppressed and harmed people in every facet of American life. And at Moms Rising, where we are multi-issue and intersectional, it is glaringly obvious in all of our advocacy in our work to lift women, families, communities, and our nation. So I just want to give a few examples. And the reason why I'm giving these examples is because this is what structural racism and white supremacy looks like. So the first example I want to give is from our workplace justice campaign, which covers issues ranging from paid family leave and fair pay. From that campaign, we know that while white women on average make 81 cents on the dollar to a man's dollar, Black women make 62 cents on that dollar, and Hispanic or Latina women make 54 cents on that man's dollar. My second example is from our maternal justice campaign, which addresses our maternal mortality crisis. Every year in the United States, 700 to 900 women die from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes, and some 65,000 suffer severe complications. These are the worst maternal mortality statistics in the developed world. But within our terrible statistics, there's this. Black women are 243% more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And this is one of the largest racial disparities in women's health. And then finally, the last example, Moms Rising's campaign to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. Dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, what this means is when children are funneled out of the public school system and into the juvenile and criminal justice system. It starts when kids are pushed out of the classroom, typically for nonviolent offenses. Black children are 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school for the same infractions as white students. And that's why armed security in schools is not a good idea, since such security frequently has a background in law enforcement, and racial bias in law enforcement is, we do not need to see that in schools. We do not need to have authoritarian, even armed racial bias inflicted on students in their place of learning or anywhere. So this brings us back to gun violence. Beyond headline grabbing, horrific mass shootings that target specific communities because of their otherness, there's the ongoing daily carnage of gun violence, which, as we know, disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities due to socioeconomic structural racism, which Greg has already made very clear. They experience 10 times the gun homicides, 15 times the gun assaults, and 3 times the fatal police shootings of white Americans. So we have 40,000 people a year die from gun violence in our country. Thousands more are injured. It's devastating our communities. It's devastating our families. And our lawmakers cannot seem to take even the smallest step in curbing it in any way, such as passing universal background checks, which 90% of Americans support. So why is that? And the answer is increasingly clear. It's because racism, hate, xenophobia, violence against women, it all springs from the same toxic roots of patriarchal white supremacy. And this white supremacy ultimately is strengthened and backed up by violence. The reason we can't get a handle on our gun violence problem is because white supremacy wants to be armed. Gun violence, it's not just about the gun, it's about who holds the gun, motivations, and who is the gun pointed at. Gun violence involves power dynamics. It involves socioeconomic conditions shaped by centuries of structural white supremacy. Because white supremacy wants to be armed, we will never get a handle on it until we do the work of dismantling white supremacy. And I'll stop there.
All right, Gloria, thank you. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think it's such an important perspective that we just need to change this system. It needs to, you know, rooting out white supremacy is incredibly important. I think Kathleen, you wanted to jump in on that.
Yes, thank you so much, Greg and Gloria, for that corrective about what we're doing here, because I think we would at our peril be in 2 different conversations about this. I think it's very, very important for all of us to be using the same terms. Where we're thinking about white supremacy, we're talking about structural racism and not just individual belief or the very, very small, comparatively small number of people who will admit that they hold racist beliefs and will then call for violence at the Capitol, right? This is a tiny, tiny fringe movement that we're talking about. When I refer to white power, I'm talking about a very small subsection of a much broader tangle of white supremacist structures, systems, histories, and beliefs that characterize American society. And I absolutely agree that those are violent, that they cling to armament and that they are absolutely inextricable with the problem of gun violence. I also think that for what it's worth, my area of study is the white power movement, but that's not the totality of what we're doing here, right? So part of what I'm very eager to do in the Q&A is think about what the relationship is between the problem of guns and white supremacy and the other problem that I think we were talking about earlier in the conversation, which is guns and the white power movement. Those are interrelated, but they're not the same problem. And I certainly would not want to imply that the problem of, the problem of domestic terrorism doesn't have even a comparable body count with the problem of police violence, which is just much bigger, much more pernicious, and much more widespread. But I do think that when we're talking about inaction in Congress, when we're talking about policy change, when we're talking about why can't we get a handle on this, the extremist movements can really do a lot to illuminate why we can't move forward with some of these political solutions. I'm sorry, it just started pouring. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so there, when we're thinking about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ted Cruz wearing the "come and take it" masks, what we're talking about is the creep of extremist ideology from these fringe movements into the mainstream of our politics. We're talking about fundamental issues like what happens if these demographic transformations that many people have understood as peaceful, in fact, are thought of not only on the fringe, but in many parts of our white supremacist political system as being tantamount to racial annihilation. And what follows from that state of emergency thinking is a series of disenfranchisement attempts like we're seeing in Georgia, a series of attempts to hang on to power through violence. And American history has a ton of examples of how this plays out, and they're very dark and discouraging examples. So I just want to say that to me, these are not mutually exclusive perspectives. I think that a study of the fringe is integral to dealing with this broader problem of gun violence.
Oh, Gloria.
David, did you want to jump in? Yeah, please.
No, Gloria had her hand up. She goes first.
Oh, Gloria, go ahead.
Okay, I completely agree, Kathleen. What we're seeing now is the very, very troubling phenomenon of the fringe coming into the mainstream. And going back to guns, I mean, Greg before referenced the fact that the law enforcement was basically a reformulation of the slave patrols during the Reconstruction era, right? But I would like to step even further back than that and just mention and talk a little bit about the roots of the Second Amendment. Some scholars, such as Carl Bogus from Rhode Island, Roger Williams University, Rhode Island, has studied the politics around the Second Amendment, and he makes a compelling case that actually the militia referenced in the Second Amendment are not the Minutemen militias that the right-wing extremists seem to feel like they're the moral descendants of, but actually like slave militias, right? So I just want to one of the things that I've really, really thought about is that to dismantle the extremism and the white nationalism, why isn't it more well known, or why isn't it a recognized fact, or why haven't we talked about the fact that the Second Amendment, is it or is it not about slave militias? And if that's the case, how can we use that to basically remove the moral foundations of white supremacy and this white nationalism that they use in order to hold on to their guns?
I think, well, David, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that or something else, because it's.
Well, I was gonna follow up on Greg's point about public health, and because it's one I really agree with. I've just spent actually the last 2 weeks writing a huge grant about it, and I think it's a critical point. And I think sometimes that point of public health is one that everybody kind of throws around. So we need to look at things with a public health lens. And I wanted folks on the call to know this is something that's really important to my unit. I mean, we're totally transparent and an open book in the work that we do with our posts. Here's an article from the University of Washington, Harvard View, and another one from Johns Hopkins for our connections with Josh and other. We're open to any researcher who wants to come in, break down, look at what we're doing, and look at everything involved at our work. We think that's critically important because our unit formed because of local King County public health groups and our board and all sorts of people who said we need to do something about gun violence. And what they looked at least from the domestic violence end, is we prohibit domestic violence offenders from having weapons systematically across this country. And then you ask yourself, well, how do you do that? And there's, there's a case that we hand them a piece of paper saying you can't have a gun. Do you do anything more than that? No, we don't do anything more than that. So this idea that, if we're going to have rules, if we're going to have laws, like how do we go about enforcing them? Do they matter? Are they a priority or not? And I think this idea also of public health and violence reduction is one that is really in its infancy in the United States. If you were to look across the country and say, what prosecutor's office has an embedded member of public health in their office? How many have that? The answer would be 0. It doesn't exist. But you go around the world, you can go to the United Kingdom, they have things like violence reduction units, partnerships with public health. Awesome, right? Partnerships with community, their public health is a part of the table. And so I totally agree with what Greg is saying. This is not something you can prosecute your way out of or incarcerate your way out of. I will say that police do have a role, though. It is difficult, and we've talked about this a lot, to say, like, well, how are we going to remove firearms from people? Where initially, when we started to do this, the police were like, you're kidding. You want us to go to this home for a civil order and take weapons from this guy who we know is highly dangerous. You want us to do that? And we're like, yeah. So they would bring out the SWAT band, and there are all these cops that would come, and it was this really intense thing. But over time, we had some police officers who were like, you know what, I'm just going to go up and talk to the guy. I'm just going to go up and talk to him and ask him for the guns. And what we found was the warm approach in dealing with many offenders was much better. And if you read that JAMA article I put in the link, it really talks about that you have to establish a new level of trust. You have to build from scratch with people and with communities, given all that has happened that led up to this point. And I think there has to be radical change, and that radical change, embedding public health, and really not just kind of like putting a Band-Aid over things, but really kind of stepping back from it and not thinking that, the criminal justice system data is going to answer all of these questions. You need to start linking that data to every type of public health data to really measure the impact of everything that is happening. And that, criminal justice data is terrible to begin with. So there's just infrastructure that needs to be done. And there's a ton of work to do. And I guess I would say, I'm a practitioner, and doing that work day to day is really important. I would love for culture change to happen this afternoon or in 5 years. I know that one of the ways that we get there is from people who are gonna do the work to build the structures that lead to that. And I do think that one of the things that we're doing in our regional firearms unit is contributing to that. It's not perfect. We're learning as we go. There's been a lot of changes along the way. But one thing that we have found out is that when you're communicating with people as human beings, you get a lot more out of it than being sharp-elbowed and being more coercive.
Let's bring the public health model in, because I think there's agreement that the model is important. When I say this as an adjunct to the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I teach health advocacy. I'm teaching tomorrow night. But as I say that, the model itself, right, is about identifying problems, right, getting data on problems, so we really know what's going on, looking at potential solutions, testing those solutions, testing them again, and rolling them out. Those solutions can come in many different facets, right? They can come in investment in education. If you think about gun violence, investment in education. They could also come in, depending on what the data looks like, it could come in the forms of an extremist protection order. I think the question that is really important here is where do we prioritize in that model? And how, when we do that, do we make sure that we're not making things worse? How do we make sure that we're taking an equity approach so that we're not creating harm in the system? And so one of the things, we've got this question in the chat, is that if we're talking about the public health model and we're talking about different interventions, one thing that comes up over and over again, right, is how do you decenter law enforcement so that you can have better policies without thinking it always as we have to have a law enforcement solution, right? There seems to be, David, absolutely, there are times when law enforcement needs to be part of the solution. But when you think about what's going on, for instance, someone brought up in the Portland example of what we're doing and what we're doing in DC now with the Reform Commission, looking at decentering police. I'm wondering, how do we achieve our goals? How do we as a movement achieve our goals? And David, do things that, for instance, and this goes to everybody, do things that only uniquely you can do, but at the same time, we're creating much broader other types of structures to deal with some of these root causes, and some of these dealing with, you know, how do we create first responders that aren't necessarily always law enforcement, things like that. So you think about the public health model, it's a comprehensive model. How do we get there and make it at the same time that we're making sure that we're not, you know, that we're looking at an equity approach so that we're making progress without causing harm, right? I think that's something that's important. And I would open that up to anybody, but Gloria, I know you thought a lot about it. You mentioned going back to, you know, you've mentioned a number of different things about, you know, systemic racism and facing that. At the same time, we're thinking about why can't we pass laws that safeguard our communities? So maybe I'll throw that to you first.
Clearly, it takes money, it takes investment, and it takes political will. I don't know if I have anything very productive to add to it, except that the public health model, I think, is a fantastic tool through which we can try to bring more immediate changes. But it also, we're talking about gun violence, it is reactive. And we also, I think, need to think in terms of proactive, which goes back to the much harder culture change and the awareness that the culture change that's happened that has brought white supremacy to where we are today took decades, centuries, right? And actually money from the NRA, they invested in it to create this moment that we have now. So yes, investment in public health, but also investment to change.
I think again is if we think about the model, I think the model can look at a number of different pieces of this, but part of that model can certainly be investing in education and community, you know, and community violence prevention and all the and fighting the root causes. So how do you, when you think about this, how do you do that analysis? How do you make sure that you're investing smartly, you're using that model without causing harm at the same time? Great.
You know, I think we've already done the research, I will argue. Now, the federal government has not funded all of it, but there's a ton of research out there about which models work. But I think as opposed to being too concerned about which models work and don't work, we have to recognize that we're already investing in models that don't work. You know, there are so many law enforcement models that have no data, shot spotter, gun buybacks, all they don't have the data, you know, to show that they drastically reduce gun violence, but yet we throw money at it. And I think we have just we've entered an era where we think the only way to think about gun violence is crime control models. And we don't have that same scrutiny, and we overlook what can be done from educational, from mental health, from public health. And we just pour into law enforcement because that's just the way it is. And I think it's terrible. And I think just to step back, the way that we start to address this is first we have to start humanizing non-white people. That is a huge problem. And the media is the biggest problem. And I hate to point at them, but if you look at what happened in Atlanta, what happened in Chicago, any shooting that does not have white faces at the front of it, it turns into a crime issue instantly. Like, it's a crime problem, it's a crime control. Even the imagery, you see yellow tape, you see bullet shells, you see police cars. You don't see the stories of people who died. You don't hear about the mental health breakdown or the bad day of the person on the other side of the gun. You just see crime, violence. This is a crime problem. And until we can start humanizing non-white folks, like we just humanizing them and saying, this is a problem, that person died, lives were lost, multiple lives were destroyed on both sides of the gun, then folks will start to see the pain, the trauma, and hopefully start to open their mind and say, oh my gosh, even the police are causing some of this chaos. So there's gotta be other ways to do this. So I really think we have to back up and say, you know, there are multiple models and solutions that exist. Right now, the federal government is funding none of them other than law enforcement, none of them. So even if they don't work, taking a shot in the dark will probably be helpful. And a lot of cities and states have already proven that it works in their communities. So that would just be my response to that.
All right. I'm going to come back to you, Greg, in 1 sec, I think, to wrap it up. But I know, David, you wanted to get something in on there, and I appreciate
I just wanted to, I'm the practitioner, so I always want like the practical stuff. And I guess I would just kind of back to this, the first principle that I understand as a criminal prosecutor of public health is data and surveillance. Like, what's really going on? And I see this at being a DV prosecutor for 23 years, that DV is not like collected, or, like we don't understand. So if we look nationally at violent death reporting, only like 4 or 5 states collect anything about DV having to do with violent death reporting. We look at homicide rates, we don't look at suicide, we don't look at any of the stuff that goes into any of this. And so that idea of data and what we are doing and how siloed it is and how it needs to be connected with each other. I'll give you a perfect example of this. If you want to know the inherent structural racism of the criminal justice system, ask, what is the breakdown of who victims are in the justice system? I'm a victim guy. This is what I do. And the truth is, for most police reports, victim data is not collected at all. Or if it is collected, it's done badly. And it's done for categories that are antiquated and old. This led to reports on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? This is a national issue now across the country. Organizations like Urban Indian Health Institute here in Seattle, who we've partnered with. We have a partnership now where we're getting training from UIHI because we're trying to correct that problem internally. How do we talk to people? What are the categories of demographic data that we should be looking at? How do we make sure to collect all 500 plus affiliated, recognized tribes and unaffiliated? And how do we do that to correct that? Because there's a structural data problem. And so connecting that and understanding it would mean like maybe we should invest in prevention across the board in many communities. DV prevention in my community, the investments that have been done with that, nothing, right? Aside from like some fundraisers that my unit has. So it's sad. And I agree. I'm sorry, Gloria. And I agree with that. And but I do think like this thing of data is really, really important because I want to know. And having that public health response, it really puts people on the same page to have like a real conversation about like, what are we going to do? Should we provide treatment, like in my field, to domestic violence offenders who commit so much violence in the community? Should we provide that for free? It's super expensive for an offender to go out and get treatment, right? And that means anybody who doesn't have means can't get treatment because they can't afford it. So like, how do we remedy that, right? Should we pay for it? And I think many things come back to the data that we have to address because it's structurally deeply flawed.
Yes, and I would agree with that. Not only does the data need to be better, there also has to be an awareness that not all data is actually paid attention to by the right people who are making the decisions, right? So for example, in Florida, the gun violence prevention movement has been fighting this effort to basically bring armed security, to bring guns into schools, right? And so, Marianne Hammer and the pro-gun legislatures, they're basically saying, well, we need to protect our students. We need to allow people to bring guns into schools. And on our side, we say, oh, no, this is not a good idea because we can protect our students because we can have armed security in our schools. But the data shows, right, that armed security or any kind of very authoritarian model really impacts Black and brown students, and it moves them into the school to prison pipeline, right? And so there are contradictions. Not only there's faulty data, there are holes in the data, and then there's who's listening to the data and they're just like contradictions that are actually doing a really good job with even what we've got.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, Gloria. I mean, I think, right, of potentially come up for a solution of individuals bringing guns to school that could create more harm or create additional harms. And I think, how do you think, Gloria, about that? What kind of data do you get? My organization, we're certainly against armed, law enforcement in schools, period, right? Because for all the reasons you mentioned, we still hear that as an option. So I think that's a really good example of, there's solutions, but if you're going to continue to cause harm, you need to identify where you're continuing to cause harm and deal with that and understand the structural racism that we're dealing with and making sure that when you're looking at these pieces, that you're not exacerbating that. And I think, Greg, I want to give you the last word here, because there seems to be a fundamental, a huge opportunity to address some of the root causes you're talking about. And what do we need to do to support that effort? So I appreciate everybody on the panel. I'm going to give Greg the last word. It's been a great discussion, but there seems to be a historic opportunity now to do something. And so what do we do? What do we do to help? Where can we get involved? What should we be doing, thinking about right now, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a pretty rare opportunity with the leaders in the White House and in the House and in the Senate to advocate for resources to help reverse a lot of the trauma and oppression and institutions that white supremacy and even the white power movement have helped build and have been celebrating and now are fighting for. And the way that we do that is through, frankly, investing in solutions that work. I strongly believe that the safest communities are not the ones with the most police, it's the ones with the most resources and opportunity. And we can start to build that. And by investing in strategies that we know reduce gun violence, but also strategies that build safer and stronger communities and healthier communities. So right now we have $5 billion on the table in the American Jobs Plan. There is $5 billion specifically for violence intervention and prevention strategies. If it makes it through reconciliation, House and the Senate, then that is real dollars that are going into 48 cities that have been most impacted. Secondly, the American Rescue Plan, a lot of those dollars are eligible to invest in solutions for neighborhoods and communities that have been most destroyed historically. And so we should all be advocating to our governors and our mayors to make sure that they're prioritizing those who have been hardest hit and how they're using those funds. There's also existing sources of funding that frankly have never really considered supporting these types of efforts. I know VOCA is one of them. Medicaid reimbursement is another area where existing funding could invest in these solutions, or at least prioritize communities that are hardest hit by poverty, by COVID-19, by gun violence. So we need to advocate for that. And I think one other thing is, there are a lot of programs, like even the ones David highlighted, that are not getting resourced and not getting supported. And this is the first time in a long time that Congress is starting to roll out earmarks. And so we need to make sure those earmarks prioritize helping the most vulnerable of us and protecting those who are most vulnerable and have not had the historical or the government support that they deserve or need to live those healthier quality lives. And so there's a lot of opportunities from a fiscal standpoint to get this done. I also think that each of us just has a responsibility to dismantle as many of these institutions as possible. We have to fight against stand your ground laws. We have to fight against a lot of the open carry laws and frankly, laws that inspire and encourage people to act out their hate through violence. And I just say, I think, this is a tough time, and I think it's been a tough time for a lot of folks, especially the last, year and a half. But what I will say is, like, we just can't overthink it. There's so little that's being done that there's enough for all of us to have an impact. And so I just hope that you'll just figure out what that looks like for you and your organization, with your time, with your audience, with your community, with your family, to figure out what you all can do to help further this, because it is incredible how little is being done, whether it's from research to gun access, to public health strategies to reduce risk factors, to protecting folks from supremacy, to dismantling these institutions. None of it has really been done right or invested in. And so we have to do that. And I think everyone can play a major role in it. So thanks again. Thanks for having me on this, Josh. And I know I got a little spirited there earlier. So
no, these are wise words. These are wise words. Very important. I mean, there seems to be so much to do that we need to get, we need to dig in. We need to lean in. We need to get moving. So I really appreciate it, Greg. I appreciate this. This has been a great conversation.
I wanted to thank Kathleen and David and Gloria too. This has been really engaging. And so I'm just thankful we shared the stage.
Yeah. Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Kathleen. Thank you, David. And Renee, thank you for inviting us all.
Thank you all so much. You each brought really important things to this conversation. And I think for those of us in Washington State and our partners from across the country, a number of the things that Greg just listed off at the very end of the panel are things that we should all be paying really close attention to, and definitely things that the Alliance is leaning into right now. So If you have questions about how you can help support our efforts in those ways, please do not hesitate to reach out. So again, thank you, panelists. Really appreciate all of you in this really important discussion. And we're going to take another quick break. So we'll be back at 11:30 to wrap up with an exercise that we hope will be illuminating for everyone involved. Thanks. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. We are just going to keep moving. I am really happy now to introduce to you a really important member of our team at the Alliance, Rebecca Johnson, who acts not only as our lobbyist, but also is absolutely instrumental in the policy development work that we do at the Alliance. So Rebecca, welcome.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. Joining you from the throes of the legislative session. Today we've been discussing the history of white supremacy, insurrection, and firearms. And over the last couple of years, the Alliance has really tried to work to center equity in our own work. And what that looks like for us and for many other organizations in the GVP world is to start really looking at the policies that we're promoting, the policies that we're putting on our agenda. And as we're looking for solutions for gun violence, what kinds of pathways for solutions that we're looking at. And as I think has been identified a number of times today, we have in the past gravitated towards criminal justice solutions for gun violence, and recognize that that is not the path, not the best path, not an appropriate path in many cases. And so what we wanted to do with you today is first talk you through some of the frameworks that we're using to do that equity analysis on policies that we're working on. I'm going to talk really pretty swiftly through a policy that was on our agenda in 2020 that we took off after we did this analysis, so it's not on our 2021 agenda. And then I think you're going to go into breakouts and work through the same policy, the same equity analysis for a bill that was introduced this year that is no longer moving through the legislature, but is a really good one to do this analysis on. So I'll get started. Okay. In 2020, we introduced a bill that was creating a new crime around threats to commit mass violence. The problem that this was solving for was one that the folks, particularly in our domestic violence and firearms enforcement unit, had identified around threats to commit mass violence that weren't actually falling into any kind of category where they could take action, either to remove firearms or to pursue criminal charges against the person communicating that threat. The context in which it was coming up at that time were a rise in white supremacist groups in and around King County and across Washington State. And it had also come up in the context of schools. So what the bill did, was create a new offense, a threat to commit mass violence. It created it as a Class C felony. And it authorized law enforcement officers who are responding to a report of a threat to remove firearms and other dangerous weapons, ammunition, concealed carry permits, if they had probable cause, if there had been a threat communicated. We know that many times in mass violence situations and in other firearm violence situations, people do communicate threats beforehand. So at the time, we felt like it was important to try to remove firearms from a dangerous situation. The situations in which the bill would have covered were knowingly threatening to commit an act of mass violence on an educational property, at a school-sponsored activity, at a place of religious worship, or at a current or former workplace of the person issuing the threat. Another problem that this was solving for was with the advance of social media and different ways of communicating, not all of our laws covered threats at that time. Not all of our laws covered threats that were communicated like through social media or other kinds of electronic communication. So this covered that. And then it established a piece that a reasonable criminal justice participant would believe the threatening person had present or future ability to carry out the threat. So that's what the bill did. And I think the next slide has some questions on it. So these are 10 questions. We actually looked at equity frameworks from a number of different venues. When we did the actual analysis on this policy, I think we went through like 47 different questions. We tried to pull the best ones from all the different models. This is a compressed version of that analysis framework that we did. So what do we define? So the first question was, what do we define as the most important racially equitable community outcome related to this policy? Well, at the time, a lot of the issues that folks were bringing to us or folks had raised were really centered sort of in the white supremacist kind of groups and threats that were happening at that time. And what we were hearing from law enforcement and prosecutors is that they really felt like their hands were tied and it was difficult to remove firearms from those dangerous situations. So that was proactively kind of going towards equity outcome. But asking the second question, which racial equity opportunities areas will the policy primarily impact and are there secondary impacts, really took us into, okay, that's sort of the King County lens. Could there be, the King County lens and these particular incidents that were happening, are there secondary impacts? What do we know about persons who are charged with felonies today? Are there other places in the state or other perspectives or other times where law enforcement or prosecutors could use this in an inequitable way, just working through a system which we know is rife with inequities? Third question, how will the policy increase or decrease racial equity? Well, again, we know the structure of the criminal justice system is steeped in racism and has just pretty much any crime, in particular felonies and guns at school, we know have a disproportionate impact on communities of color. So that goes into the framework. What are the benefits of the policy? Okay, so the problem again that it was trying to solve for was people who could be a future threat of violence often broadcast that threat. Removing firearms from those situations can de-escalate and decrease the probability of violence. This gave law enforcement and prosecutors an additional tool to remove firearms from those situations. And like in the case of schools, I think there were times where students would come forward and report threats, but then not want to be witnesses. So this was a way that folks felt like those cases could move forward. Potential unintended consequences, and this is really looking at who today, in terms of kids, in terms of community at large, are the focus of law enforcement activity, and therefore who's likely to be the focus of this under this policy. The original bill was actually less limited than the bill that I described, and it included threats to any workplace, not just the person's workplace. So just taking a look at what other situations could this law be could this law be used under? What other situations might a prosecutor try to use this? And then looking at how if we were to move forward with this policy, and actually, but as we're developing policy, really challenging ourselves to say, how have we partnered with community members and stakeholders on this policy? How will we partner with community members and stakeholders? And in this case, we found that we had partnered primarily with law enforcement partners and stakeholders, and we were missing that community voice and that community engagement. And then looking forward, if this law were to pass, how are we going to evaluate what the impact of this law is on racial equity over time? And how are we going to retain that participation with other stakeholders and ensure both internal accountability and public accountability? It happens very often that laws will pass and we don't always spend the time we need to implement it. And even more frequently, we don't spend the time to make sure there's a feedback loop to make sure the law is actually working in the way that we intended it to. Ninth question, what is unresolved? In this case, we said, okay, there's community members and groups that haven't been a part of this conversation that need to be, if we're gonna move forward with this. We need to have more, I guess this is moving into 10, resources, information, and partnerships. We need to have more information about what's happening in schools today, and are there other ways that we can tackle this issue? So after we did this analysis, we decided that it was not appropriate for it to be on our 2021 legislative agenda. And I'm not sure if it'll appear on a future agenda. There are still the problems that were identified as needing to be solved do still exist. But I think we are looking to create a larger structure and larger dialogues to find different pathways, pathways to address those. Okay, so that was like the speed version of the equity questions. And I think you're going to be doing another kind of quick version in your breakout groups. I will say we've done this exercise with ourselves and then with our board and with a few different groups. And you don't have to spend, I would say, because we're in a compressed time, don't worry about writing down the perfect answer. A lot of this is just kind of training our brains to look for things that we're not seeing. Often we'll be like, okay, this is a problem that we're trying to solve. Does this solve it? Without thinking about those secondary consequences, unintended consequences, and then looking at how we can mediate them. So Renee or anyone, is there anything else you'd like me to say about this?
No, I think that that's great, Rebecca. Thank you so much. And, you know, our hope today is that our various stakeholders that are represented in the summit today will now have the opportunity to kind of walk through this exercise on a different policy that was on our agenda this year, but as Rebecca mentioned, is now dead in the legislative process. You know, the way that we're thinking about this is at the Alliance, this is an evolution. We are learning every step of the way. And so even during session this year, having an equity lens applied to a bill that did make our agenda, we ended up realizing some things that, again, we had blinders on to see when we were first developing the policy. So we share this as a way of sharing both sort of our organizational evolution and what we're trying to do in terms of, like Rebecca said, retraining our brain, but also to demonstrate that we're not going to get it right every time. And this is a place where we didn't get it right. And so wanted to give you all the opportunity to sort of go through that exercise in small groups now. So I think Chelsea's going to break us up into small groups. We'll have a period of time. We don't have group leaders, so I think it's just an open discussion, walking through those questions that Chelsea put the document in the chat, so you should all have access to it, to the policy that we're going to be reviewing in your small groups. So hope that you get something out of this exercise, and we'll see you back here in just a little bit.
About the stakeholder piece, and this is something that you know, we're relying on the people who are most impacted to kind of help us with our blind spots when we're evaluating legislation. And what I keep coming back to is like, it's just so unfair that like we have to ask for the labor of other people who are oppressed to make sure we're not further oppressing them. And I'm wondering kind of how you all approach that, because you want to make sure those perspectives are front and center, and yet if they're not part of your organization, they're not getting paid a salary. How do you navigate that?
Renee, I'm happy to answer unless you'd like to.
No, go for it, Dylan.
It's a great question, Cos. Yes. Yeah, that's something we're struggling with as well. How best to approach these spaces in a way that is equitable in our communicative relationship, right? I think, you know, one of the best ways to go about that is to identify the folks who are working in the space already, and not asking folks to do something that they don't have a professional capacity to do. So that's like step one, folks like Greg Jackson, for example. But then also there are, you know, like to your point, Cos, folks in the community who've been doing the work for decades, unpaid, unrecognized. And how do we ask for their energy, which they're already dedicating into some very, very tough places, to engage with us and say, hey, are we writing this policy right? Please. So Cos, you know, I think we're doing our best with that and trying to communicate as best as we can, but we are very much in a learning process as well. We are not here to say
Same.
Yeah, that, you know, oh, we have the answer to how to do this. Nobody does. No, I really don't think so. And so we're, you know, conversations like this, holding the tension, being uncomfortable, and, you know, looking forward to learning and screwing up, you know, and taking what we can from those moments. That's a great question, Cos.
Thank you.
And I think one other thing I would add to that, Cause, is that, you know, as we continue to elect leaders who are more representative of the communities that they're serving, we're getting great feedback and interaction with a more diverse slate of representatives and senators, and that has been extremely helpful. So our continued sort of commitment and effort to try to endorse and support candidates that look like the communities that they're serving is another piece of that, which is not directly related to our own internal policy review, but I think is part of the larger picture.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you.
From my perspective as a retiree and a grandfather, and someone who receives emails from the Brady Foundation and the Giffords Foundation daily asking for money, what I find I would rather give is my experience, my ideas. I've been an educator, was an educator for almost 50 years. And I keep coming back to education and how to keep a conversation going, which is what we're doing now. I would like to maybe see the organization, the Alliance, do more of that kind of coordinating, which I'm so familiar with from the classroom, to get more people talking in smaller groups, as we were doing a short time ago, to inform and gather at the same time. So my 2 cents is taking more time to talk in groups, perhaps in committees, and feeding that back to the larger conversation.
Oh, thanks for that, Peter. Yeah, we're pulling experience from all places at this time. So having you with us here today, as from the perspective of an educator, a longtime educator, is really valuable. And you know, we're exploring any and all options that way, and how to better engage our base. And you know, I think we're gonna you know, wrap up relatively soon. I definitely want folks to keep chatting here on this, but I think I've got some stuff to point out in our closing remarks on that, Peter. So thanks for priming it, as it were. Yeah.
Can I just add, following up on what Peter said? Yeah, so part of, you know, I feel like the Alliance has to do, I mean, individually, I think we're all doing this over the course of the last year. Those of us, they're not people of color, and you're learning more, understanding more. The things that have impacted me the most are, like there was a discussion, for example, that the Mariners had with their African-American players talking about their experience growing up, their experience driving, their experiences getting pulled over multiple times, and just putting your head into that situation. So like looking at legislation and trying to understand, okay, wow, open carry. If I've seen guys down at the ice cream store, white guys with open carry weapons. That was, how different is it in a predominantly white community if that were an African-American individual open carrying? They each have that right here. So just kind of whatever it takes to, I don't feel like we are in like I am in a good position to understand where that, how our legislation should be worded so that it makes sure that we're doing it appropriately through an equity lens.
I was wondering if I need guidance to deal with family and friends. Now this is out of state, but I typed on the chat that I have a cousin in South Dakota who talked to her the other day on the phone, and she is afraid of Antifa, and said that several of the men in her community, they took their AR-15s out and they let these people know that they could not create trouble in her neighborhood. And she was very proud of that. She told me about having her concealed weapon permits, and she's going to try to get an unregistered weapon. And this is all based on this fear in an area where there aren't very many minorities. They get a lot of misinformation. How can we counteract that? Because if we get more people realizing that this is something we need to do with, we may get less pushback. They can start pushing on their legislators as well. But I need a way to try to change hearts and minds of people that I don't want to just start an argument with.
I have been in a similar situation with relatives in central Wyoming who are of, I might say, of the same ilk, but they're relatives and I love them. I listen to them first, and usually I'll start asking questions that don't necessarily have an agenda, but that allow these relatives to listen to themselves in a somewhat broader perspective. And I see over years, unfortunately, I see things changing for them, especially their kids, the next generation. And again, my bias is as an educator, listening and then asking questions has always been my MO as a teacher. And you can teach your family as well. I guess that's an approach that works for me because I believe in it.
Thanks for that, Peter. That's really helpful. And I think I would also encourage people to, I think we have some good resources on our website to share information with people. And, just continuing to try to open the hearts and minds of people that we're related to and are in our circles. So again, apologies that the small groups got broken up too early. We really encourage you all to spend some time with our ever evolving equity tool and the policy that we put forward. We'll also be sending out a survey here shortly to get feedback on the summit and encourage you to share ideas for future topics that you might like us to be discussing. And I think I'm going to throw it over to Dylan now to wrap us up for the day.
Thanks, Renee, and thanks to everybody still here with us. And I know most of them aren't here, but thank you to the panelists and Mary and Josh for helping us out today. You know, we covered a lot of stuff today, folks. You know, this was an extremely broad topic series, and wasn't easy to kind of thread from one thing to another. But you know, so at the beginning of the day with Mary, we identified that the white identity-based terrorism is really, of course, it's a problem and a problem we need to address, but it's also the most visible symptom of the baked-in racial inequities and how we perceive gun violence in the United States. You know, it's the most visible tip of the iceberg that folks engage on, and what gets media attention, and what will galvanize white-led organizations and other gun violence prevention organizations to really move when it's time to do so. The rest of that iceberg is really what Greg and Gloria were alluding to about, you know, when we focus our conversation on the role of law enforcement, we miss a huge segment of what our work needs to be doing and the direction in which it needs to evolve if we really mean what we say about equity in the gun violence prevention space. If you felt uncomfortable today during our panel, if you felt that tension, good. So do we. Welcome to the future of the gun violence prevention movement. This is going to be our priority. This is the way it's going to work from now on. You know, we're not going to shy away from being uncomfortable and trying to hold tension between what seems like disparate spaces, even though they're not. It's, you know, as we've become a tip of the spear organization in gun violence prevention, at least at the state level and increasingly nationwide, it's our responsibility to demonstrate that being uncomfortable is healthy and necessary to what we need to be doing next. And I really want to address a couple of the things mentioned during our chat here today, and something that Greg specifically brought up about the media representation of gun violence and the way that folks engage on that. You know, as a nonprofit organization, to some degree, we are hamstrung a little bit, and you know, engagement dictates what we are able to do. So what our base does and does not engage on has a lot to do with what is feasible at the organization. And I just want to, you know, point out that after Boulder, I got a ton of calls and emails asking me and our staff where we're at on an assault weapons ban and high capacity magazine restriction, and how are we going to stop this from happening again. I got no correspondence about Atlanta. I got no correspondence about the shooting in South Seattle at the church, which is a serious problem. So again, being uncomfortable is important. Showing up in spaces you're uncomfortable in is important. But you know, we're very appreciative of everything that our base does. You folks are superheroes. But we, you know, I think the healthiest thing we can pull out of today's conversation is that we as individuals and as a movement need to continue to change and continue to bring an increasingly wider context to everything we do, not just policy development and implementation, but our grassroots engagement as well. So if you're there with us, great. I can't wait to see you on the front lines of all these things. And it's so great to see so many familiar faces. And thank you for being with us here today. And you know, we're going to be sort of cobbling all the things together, all the links and documents and recordings and getting it out to folks. But in the meantime, please feel free to reach out directly with any comments, questions, concerns you may have. Happy to sit with you and talk with anybody about anything that's on your mind. And then, just again, thank you so much for spending the time and energy and sharing that space with us here today. It was great. So hope to talk to you all soon. And yeah, we'll be charging forward.
Thank you, Dylan. Bye-bye.
Bye, Eleanor.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
All of you.
Thank you so much.